Why is Donald Trump claiming victory this week? And why does one Supreme Court judge think that the president is now a king above the law? And what about this email we've had from John Jenkins, who asks, could President Biden now issue a decree as part of his official duties that Trump be removed from all ballot papers and the Republican Party must find a new candidate? Is that within the powers of the USA King? Well, don't worry, we'll explain it all. Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Anthony here in the BBC Bureau in Washington, D.C.
And Sarah Smith sat beside Anthony this week, which is good news
again
for both of us, yes. And in our comfortable new studio, which you can watch on YouTube if you like.
So it's Tuesday. Yesterday, the Supreme Court finished its term, and like a 4th of July fireworks celebration, the biggest explosions came at the very end.
Yeah, this is absolutely astonishing. We knew this was going to be big, but we didn't know how huge it was going to be when the Supreme Court finally gave us their ruling on whether Donald Trump and, of course, therefore all former presidents have immunity from criminal prosecution. They have cast it very wide, shall we say, the things that presidents can do in office and not fear being dragged into court afterwards.
Yeah, I host a little Zoom session for BBC staff at the end of the Supreme Court term as decisions are coming through. And so I was the one clicking refresh, looking at the Supreme Court's webpage to see when this decision would come down. And we knew it was going to come last. And as I was reading the first few lines about it, about how Trump had total and complete immunity in certain instances, you can actually hear gasps around the newsroom as the seriousness, the scope of this decision came through. We were all expecting some sort of a half and half, glass half full, glass half empty kind of a decision. And this was a little bit of that, but it was much more tilted towards Donald Trump and his position than I think most prognosticators expected.
You've read a lot more Supreme Court decisions in your life than I have, so I'm going to try like the layman's version, and you can tell me where I've got it right and wrong. Okay, so as I understand it, the Supreme Court have said that no former president can be criminally prosecuted for anything that they did as an official act of their presidency, when they were acting as the president. And of course, they have said there are things that whoever is the president, he or she could do, which are clearly not official acts. But the key thing, and what I think surprised a lot of people, was they were very broad in what appears to be their definition of what a presidential act is. It's not just the narrow confines of his duty. It comes close to being most things a president would do whilst president.
Yeah, I'd say that that's 90% right. There is a little bit of grayness in the opinion. They said that there were certain things that the president did that were in his core powers as president, such as appointing ambassadors, conducting foreign policy, where it's just blanket, total immunity, full stop. The rest of the area of official actions, well out to the edge of official actions, that has a presumptive assumption of immunity, but that doesn't guarantee it. That if you want to prosecute the president for something like that, you have to make a case to a judge that while he was acting in his official capacity, there was a reason why he should still be prosecuted for it. It's a high bar to reach, and the way the justices laid this out, it's going to be really hard for, say, Jack Smith to use that to prosecute Donald Trump for an official act. But there is a gray area that they can work with, and then anything that's unofficial, you can have at and prosecute, although you can't introduce evidence from those official actions when you're prosecuting for an unofficial action. So again, that makes it really difficult, I think, for any kind of a prosecution of the president. And all of this, of course, is going to have to be hashed out by lower courts that look at this decision and then apply it specifically to Donald Trump.
Now, this ruling could last for decades, for generations, for centuries, and confer this immunity on future presidents. But, of course, it really matters in the case of Donald Trump and the 3 criminal cases he's facing, and most importantly, that one about trying to overturn the election results in January the 6th. And so, as I understand it, some of the things that formed part of that case, like the conversations he had with his Department of Justice officials about trying to find evidence of voter fraud, that's now definitely covered by immunity.
Done, yes, fully immune.
Conversations with Mike Pence about getting him to try and stop the certification of Joe Biden as a president, maybe immune.
Seems like an official act, they said, but could be in this outside limits that could be pierced and prosecuted, but a lower court would have to determine that.
inciting a crowd to march up to the Capitol if a court determined it was incitement by making a speech to his supporters outside the White House on the morning of January the 6th, immune or not?
Probably immune. Again, not a core presidential official act, but one that the justices said probably is part of his official duties and therefore would have a higher bar for prosecution.
Tweeting to tell people to come to Washington on the 6th of January, which Liz Cheney and the Jan 6 committee said he summoned the crowd with that tweet. Is that an official presidential act?
Yeah, that's a good question. They didn't get into that, but that is, it's on his personal Twitter account. Is he talking about a political rally because he's campaigning as a private citizen, or is this an official event? I think that one, again, a gray area where, I mean, on all of these, the lower court's going to look, the trial court judge is going to look at this, make a decision. Donald Trump's going to appeal. It could go to an appellate court. They could make a decision. Donald Trump, if he loses, could appeal again. It could go back to the Supreme Court, which they could decide, okay, in this particular instance, this is within the protected area or not. All of this. Months and months, years, maybe never.
And this has always been Donald Trump's preferred legal strategy, even long before he was elected president. Delay, 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 just keep the lawyers busy, and it stops a judgment coming down.
Exactly. And we were talking about this specific case, but this decision has much further scope than this. This is not just Donald Trump and what he can do or what he did as president, but what he could do in the second term, what Joe Biden could do, what a future president could do, thinking, I don't have to worry about being criminally prosecuted for something I did. That, in the view of the majority justices, gives the president more freedom to act and not have to look over his or her shoulder constantly. But according to the dissenting justices, that essentially gives a president a free rein to do whatever he wants and break the law without worrying about repercussions.
Yes, and that's why one of those dissenting justices said the president is now a king above the law. And you know what? Maybe this is embarrassing to admit, I didn't know the king was above the law, or the queen for that matter. When the dissenting justices said this, I had to quickly Google it and discover that, yes, the British monarch cannot be prosecuted because it is the crown that takes the case. So you couldn't have Charles III versus Charles III in court. But yeah, I was unaware that he was immune up until now.
Well, neither did I. Good thing to learn something new about British law every day. But hey, it's almost the 4th of July. We overthrew a monarchy, and now maybe we've got something akin to it, at least in the view of the dissenting justices.
Yes, and a despotic president. No wonder Joe Biden is warning voters to think twice before they re-elect Donald Trump, now that he could have this broad immunity to do whatever he wanted. It's important that we unpick exactly what this Supreme Court ruling means, because it could be so momentous for future presidents. So to do that, we've invited on Alison LaCroix. She's a constitutional law expert who's a professor at the University of Chicago. She can help us understand this. Hello, Alison. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
How big a deal would you say this really is then?
It's an extremely big deal. I mean, I think, there was this sense in the last few weeks as the court was creeping toward the end of its term and then adding extra days to issue decisions. And everybody kind of predicted that the very last decision they issued would be the Trump immunity decision. But it felt a little bit like some kind of limited series or reality television show where the court itself is saying the big blockbuster, the cliffhanger is coming at the very end. And it had this quality that I think was the justices knowing it's a very, very, very big deal. It actually being that way in terms of the analysis the court carried forward. And I think one could really scratch their head a bit and say to the court, listen, you need to sort of treat this in a way that doesn't make it as suspenseful and almost kind of like a sort of circus, and really deal with it, and say, this is a big deal. We understand it's serious. Or indeed not have granted the appeal from the lower court, months and months ago, and said, we don't need to get involved, because the realist account here is also that all of this delay only helps former President Trump. And so the court, it pretends, I think, that it doesn't exist in any kind of political context, but all of us looking at it know that of course it does.
Yeah, so one of the hypotheticals was that the president could order the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival and be immune from prosecution. Can that possibly be true?
The way the majority opinion from the court reads suggests that would be covered by immunity. It's stunning to think about it, and I think that's why the the justices who are dissenting bring it up. I think the reason it would be covered by immunity on the theory that the court endorses is that it would be a scenario there of the president speaking to members of the military who are kind of over the president's executive branch. The president has control over them. Therefore, the president giving this order seems like it would be covered. And then we think about other ways that the court talked about immunity. They say it's irrelevant, basically, what the motive of the president might be. So we can't look to motive. So, for instance, assassinate a political rival, not relevant. They also say the fact that the president is potentially engaging in activity that otherwise violates laws, is illegal, is also irrelevant. They say that quite clearly. So I think the only hope in a situation like that for perhaps holding the president to account would be if we had a sort of a sifting process from a lower court to say, okay, there's a presumption of immunity, but that doesn't mean always 100% immunity, absolute immunity. So can they make an argument that in this case, yes, most of the time we think the president is immune from prosecution, but there are reasons in this particular instance that presumed immunity is outweighed.
So we've actually had a contact from one of our Americasters, Jeff G., who asks a very similar question along these lines. While we're talking about assassination, I want to ask you this as well. He says, could Joe Biden legally send in a SEAL team to assassinate Donald Trump, as Trump represents a real threat to the security of America and its constitution, in Jeff G.'s opinion there, presumably? I mean, would Joe Biden even need a reason like that to send a SEAL team to assassinate Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, here we get to a little bit of a distinction between the kind of lawfulness of the action. You know, nobody, I think, is saying that it would be legal or lawful for a president to do that engage in that hypothetical. But the question is more, could the president be called into account? And that may feel very legalistic, but I think, you know, the way the court wrote the opinion yesterday is very legalistic, where they say, even though these things seem like outrageous or beyond the scope of what we've ever thought presidents should or could be doing, it's the case that a court can't sort of look over the president's shoulder and tell them you should or shouldn't do that. The president just gets to say, look, I'm in charge of the military, I'm in charge of the executive branch, and that's it, you know. And so I think at that level, the way to think about a decision like that would be courts can't second guess the president's decision to do something like that.
And so the other example that the dissenting justices came up with, I'll just put this one to you quickly as well. Could the president organise a military coup to hold on to power and be immune from prosecution?
Well, that example could be a little trickier in terms of just saying, yes, sweeping immunity, because it might depend who's involved in the coup. I mean, it feels strange to respond with that level of granularity. But so the states are a different system from the federal government. They're different from the executive branch. What about private parties? I think the court's opinion does not say sweeping immunity applies when it's the president dealing with private individuals, like people who are not officers of the United States government. So to the extent the coup involves those people, I think there wouldn't be immunity. There would at least be some process by which a court could investigate what the president did or didn't do, or the allegations. But if it's just a straightforward military coup using, again, the military chain of command within the federal government, then I think the suggestion would be, yeah, the president would say, I'm immune. Court, you can't look over my shoulder. You can't sort of second guess what I've done.
Now, I haven't seen a lot of people on the left calling for Joe Biden, at least seriously calling for Joe Biden to assassinate Donald Trump. But one of the things I have seen is some people saying, well, Joe Biden now has all this power. Why doesn't he just unilaterally forgive student debt or expand the Supreme Court or install an ethics guidelines and investigate Supreme Court justices? Does this decision give Biden the power to do that?
No, most of those things are clearly outside the president's power under the Constitution. And so even when the court talks about these kind of core constitutional powers where the president has the strongest form of absolute immunity, they did say, tie that back to the text of the Constitution, Article 2 specifically, where we talk about what the president's powers are. So the president cannot pass legislation, can't pass a law the way Congress does. That's Congress's constitutional power. So there still is a sort of upstream question about is the president acting within the zone of presidential power? And that would be a potential way to challenge what a president is doing, which is to say, I understand that the president's immune in these various domains, but even what the president's doing is outside the scope of the president's like fundamental constitutional authority. I think that would be a tough road for someone to try to make progress on in litigation, especially before a Supreme Court or a federal court like the Supreme Court that we just got this opinion from. But I think as a matter of constitutional law, it isn't the case that the president now has all power that anybody in the federal government has and can act unilaterally.
Right. It's a question of criminal law and criminal prosecution, but there are still other checks on the president that the Supreme Court seems more than willing to enforce. And that actually gets to...
So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
But so you can't forgive student debt, but you can organize a military coup. That's where we're saying the checks and balances exist now.
That seems you can't be criminally prosecuted for organizing a military coup. I mean, yeah, it is kind of absurd when you think about it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think the court would say, other checks exist, right? Impeachment and removal, response, that's very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, that's a real check, right? Oh, you can't assassinate Donald Trump. You might get impeached.
Yes, or you can only assassinate Donald Trump as long as you've got more than 60 senators.
Right. And this actually brings back. There's been a lot of comparisons of Richard Nixon and what Richard Nixon would have gone through during Watergate if he had had these kind of broad powers.
And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think too that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
That's something one of our other Americast listeners referenced. Philip in Kent says, has the Supreme Court justified President Nixon's belief that, quote, when the president does it, it means it's not illegal? That is a shift from the way people were looking at it back in the Nixon years, wasn't it?
It is. I mean, I think one way that we could think about the Nixon example is in all of the sort of Nixon-Watergate events and then ultimately litigation, to the extent that President Nixon was instructing his aides or other people in the federal government to do certain things, those actions would now be shielded under the opinion in Trump versus United States. Because again, they're part of this core executive branch functioning. The president, as the court said, talking to the vice president, talking to the attorney general, all of those are people in the executive branch. When we think in the Trump instance, or when we try to sort of apply the Trump decision to the Nixon facts, to the extent President Nixon was giving orders or supervising people, burglars, people who weren't actually part of the executive branch, that wouldn't be shielded by the majority in the Trump case's view of immunity. And so to the extent he's, perhaps talking to civilians or non-federal officials, there's the possibility of criminal liability there. Also, I think the Trump court in its decision took care to distinguish between criminal prosecution of the president and the president as a kind of peripheral participant in judicial process. This was quite interesting. They said, in the Nixon case, much of what President Nixon was fighting was the court making him turn over tapes and materials, records, documents, that kind of thing. And the Trump court says that still is fine, as in a court can request that and can compel the president to turn over material, because that's not as much of an invasion of the executive power as making the president a criminal defendant is. And so I think they might try to parse the distinction between the ultimate sort of affront to the executive branch, which is United States versus Trump. I mean, it's right there in the name of the case, Trump as defendant, versus Trump as someone who is, producing documents or being asked by a court, listen, we really need you to turn over this material. We might do forms of review of it that keep it within the court. We don't distribute it to the populace. That's also part of the Nixon Supreme Court case holding. And the court now seems to say there's still some window for that. But it's interesting to say you only have a president as a criminal defendant, and one would imagine, when the president has done bad things and been charged and indicted and gone through all these other processes. So yes, that seems like a lot more of an invasion of the executive branch, but it comes after a lot of other judicial process that we might think safeguards the criminal system from just being casually thrown against any and every president.
Yeah, because if we think about this practically, Alison, you had Nixon, who potentially could have been criminally prosecuted, but he was pardoned by Gerald Ford when he took over the presidency. We've got Donald Trump, who has been indicted in these criminal cases. And between the two of them, not really anything that anybody suggested might have been a criminal act. You know, previous presidents don't seem to have needed the immunity that the Supreme Court has handed down to them. So can we therefore sort of be reassured that generally the people who are elected to the Oval Office don't want to do criminal things, or should we be worried that from now on people who get in there know they can get away with it?
I think we have to worry about not only laws changing, but also norms eroding and being broken. So when I think about teaching U.S. constitutional law, there were a set of norms that one could push upon in class with hypotheticals. If you looked at the Nixon cases and even the Clinton cases, and one could say, well, you know, President Nixon fires a series of these federal officials, attorneys general, and the response was usually, well, but the political climate was such that there were kind of informal norm-based limits on what he would have done. He would have suffered political repercussions. And that was true as a factual matter at that point, 50 some years ago. Now, I think we're in a world where norms and law have changed. The exception will be non-immunity, and the background assumption in most cases will be immunity. And that's a signal for presidents going forward that you can't really unwind once it's out there.
Voters must be thinking this is looking highly political. I know in the sort of 20 or so years that I've been covering American politics, the Supreme Court used to be very exalted, held in very, very high esteem. Presidents wouldn't criticise it. We had Joe Biden going on television the same day as this decision, saying how appalled he was by it. And people do see it as much, much more political, really radical decisions that they're making, and all on the right side of politics, the right-wing side of politics. And so voters are eventually going to lose their reverence for the Supreme Court, and there are at least half of them who disagree with these decisions.
Yes, I mean, I think we're certainly seeing that, and we saw a little bit of that, or actually kind of a lot of that in 2020, in the last presidential election, when we had shifts on the Supreme Court, very public, and the then candidate, Trump, talking about how he would appoint a justice right away, and then that was indeed what happened. And so one thing that will be interesting to watch is, do voters understand the tight connection between the court and the president? That if you don't like what the Supreme Court is doing, the only recourse you have in the United States system is to vote for someone else as president. I mean, justices get on the Supreme Court and they stay there for life. And so even though it feels like a very long game, I think if people become so disillusioned with politics that they don't even vote for president, that's very scary, because the only real lever we have is in electing the president.
Well, Alison and LaCroix, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us on that, and a very, very monumental decision from the Supreme Court. Thanks for being on Americast.
Thank you.
That point, of course, about the only way to change the judges on the Supreme Court is to vote for a different president, doesn't mean you guarantee it, does it? Because, I mean, Trump was in for one term and he got to appoint 3 justices. I don't think it's quite a record, but it must be close to it. And Joe Biden's only had 1 so far. It's it's the luck of the draw, really, isn't it?
It's the wheel of fate, I suppose, on when justices die, but also there is some design behind it. You remember Barack Obama, Antonin Scalia died in the last year of his term, and it was Republicans, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who held that seat open for almost an entire year to let Donald Trump fill it. Elections have consequences. Obviously, if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, we would be talking about a durable liberal majority on the Supreme Court for a generation, because it would have been Scalia's seat replaced and also Ginsburg's seat replaced with a liberal justice. That is how much that election really mattered to not just what happened for those 4 years, but policies, things like abortion and affirmative action and environmental regulation that are going to be with us for a generation. All right, well, I'd like to remind all of our viewers that you could reach out to us. We're happy to answer your questions, eager, in fact, to hear them. You can reach us on WhatsApp at +44 330 123 9480, via email, americast@bbc.co.uk, and on social media at #Americast.
Those of you who use Discord know perfectly well that you'll find the Discord link in the description of this podcast. And I'm sure you also know that you will hear Americast first and in full as a podcast on BBC Sounds. And we'll see you all later.
Bye.